I didn't get rejected. That's what they told everyone. That I wasn't chosen. That the ritual simply passed over me. No bond. No wolf. No future. And I believed them. Because nothing happened. No pain. No pull. No voice in my head whispering a name that wasn't mine. Just silence. Complete. Humiliating. Silence. But here's what no one talks about. Not every failure looks like rejection. Some look like control. I remember that night with perfect clarity. The night of the binding ceremony. The entire council was present. Elders in their ceremonial gray. Alphas standing rigid at the perimeter. And the High Seer himself. A man who hadn't attended a ritual in over 20 years. His presence alone should have been a warning. But I was too busy trying to steady my breathing, too focused on finally proving I had a place in this world, to notice what his attendance really meant. When my turn came, I stepped into the circle of chalk and elder ash, and for 1 second, just one, the air changed. Not around me, inside me. Something ancient stirred, not a wolf, not anything I had a name for. Something that felt older than the pack, older than the bloodlines, older than the laws carved into the stone walls of this hall. And it didn't want to bond with anything. It wanted to wake up. Then it was gone, snuffed out like a flame someone covered with their hand. The elders exchanged looks. The High Seer rose from his seat, and he spoke the words that carved themselves into the walls of my memory. Out loud, he said, "You were never meant to be chosen." Every face in the hall turned away, but as the circle closed around me, as the chalk burned cold against my feet, he leaned close and whispered something only I could hear. "You were meant to be sealed." That night, my life split in two. The version of me that believed I was nothing, and the version that understood, deep in a place no ritual could reach, that something inside me had just been buried alive. Everyone who turned their back on me after that night, every alpha who refused eye contact, every elder who flinched when I entered a room. They weren't ignoring me. They were watching, waiting, making sure the seal held. They should have finished the job. My name is Emily Robert, and I grew up in Ironmere, a pure wolf settlement, built into the base of a mountain range, so old the elders claimed even the stone remembered things. Ironmere wasn't cruel, exactly. It was careful. The kind of place where rules aren't spoken aloud, because everyone already knows them. Where deviation isn't punished so much as quietly erased. Where silence is the most dangerous thing in the room. Every pup born in Ironmere goes through the binding ceremony at 18. It's the rite that connects you to your wolf. The spiritual half that runs alongside you for the rest of your life. Bond successfully, and you're assigned a rank. Given a purpose. Woven into the pack, like thread into fabric. Fail to bond, and you become what I became. Unclaimed. The unclaimed weren't exiled. Not officially. But the pack made its position known in the way packs always do, through absence rather than action. Conversations died when you approached. Eyes found other things to look at. You ate at the outer tables, trained in the secondary yards, existed in the margins of a world that had quietly decided you didn't belong in the center of it. I spent 3 years building a life in those margins. I worked as a record keeper for the Eastern Elder Post, a job nobody else wanted, which meant nobody noticed when I was there, and nobody missed me when I left. I was good at it, organized, unobtrusive, a woman-shaped shadow that the pack had collectively agreed not to look at too hard. I thought I understood why. I thought the ritual had simply skipped me, a fluke, a deficiency, a body that the wolf didn't want to inhabit. What I didn't know, what no one had thought to explain, because explaining would have required acknowledging I existed, was that the ritual hadn't failed at all. It had done exactly what it was designed to do, and whatever had stirred inside me on the night of the ceremony was still there, waiting, patient the way only ancient things can be patient, growing. If you've ever been told you weren't enough, stay with Emily. Her story is just getting started. Subscribe to Adeline's Story Vault so you never miss what comes next. The Eastern Elder Post was a stone building with no windows on the northern wall, and a draft that never stopped, no matter how much they stuffed the gaps with old pelt. I kept the records of pack transactions, territory disputes, breeding registrations, resource claims, grievance logs, the kind of paperwork that everyone needed to exist and no one wanted to touch. I was good at finding patterns in things, numbers lined up neatly for me, dates connected to each other, with a logic that felt almost musical. I never said this out loud. Competence from the unclaimed was unwelcome in Ironmere. It raised questions about why you weren't bonded, which raised questions no one wanted answered. So I was careful. I filed things correctly, but not quickly. I found errors, but reported them a few days late. I shrank my usefulness into a shape that felt safe. It took me 3 years to notice what I should have noticed in the first week. The animals outside went quiet whenever I stepped through the doorway, not just skittish, silent. Birds mid-song, squirrels frozen on branches. Once, a raven that had been circling the records hall for weeks landed on the window ledge and stared at me for 11 minutes without blinking. I counted. I was trying not to think about what it meant. Alpha Scott ran Ironmere the way a clock runs, with precision and zero tolerance for parts that didn't fit the mechanism. He was 34, built like a man who had never once considered the possibility of losing, and possessed of a specific talent for looking through people rather than at them. He looked through me with unusual consistency. Other unclaimed were ignored the way background furniture is ignored, present, but unremarkable. Scott's attention simply moved over them and landed somewhere else. With me, it was different. His gaze would reach the edge of my presence and then actively redirect, like a hand that pulls back from a flame it doesn't want to acknowledge is hot. I'd caught it 3 times in the past month alone. The slight tensing of his jaw, the deliberate shift of focus. Once, in the main hall during a resource briefing, his eyes had started to move in my direction, and he'd stood up abruptly, cutting the meeting short. Nobody else seemed to notice, or they were all very practiced at pretending they didn't. It happened on a Tuesday, ordinary as rain. I was transferring old territory maps from crumbling parchment to fresh paper. Careful work, the kind that required 2 hands and complete focus. The candle to my left had been burning for an hour. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular. I was thinking about lunch. The map tore slightly in my left hand. A tiny thing. A paper-thin rip through the corner of the Westfield boundary. I felt a brief flicker of frustration, and every candle in the room went out. All 7 of them. Simultaneously. Not a gust of air. There was no air. The flames simply ceased. Like something had unmade the concept of fire in that room for exactly 3 seconds. Then they came back on, all at once, as if nothing had happened. I sat very still for a long time. Then I filed the torn map, rewrote the boundary markings, went home, told no one. But as I walked back through the settlement that evening, I noticed Elder Thane standing at the mouth of the record hall, watching the building, with an expression I'd never seen on an elder's face before. Fear. 2 weeks after the candles, I learned what Elder Thane had written in his private log. I wasn't supposed to see it. It came through my desk in a misfiled packet, tucked between 2 routine land surveys. He'd written it in the old formal hand, the one reserved for council documentation. Incident at the record hall. Candidate EV power regulation breach. Minimal. Seal holding at 94%. Recommend silent escalation. Alpha Scott notified. Do not confront subject directly. Observation protocol extended 6 months. I read it 4 times. Then I understood what I'd been looking at for 3 years. I hadn't been ignored. I'd been monitored. Somewhere in the Eastern Elder Post, there was a log with my name on every page. Every animal that had gone still near me. Every temperature fluctuation in rooms I occupied. Every time a fire burned higher when I was upset, or a storm rolled in when I cried. They had been cataloging symptoms and reporting to an alpha who pretended he'd never seen my face. His name was Elijah, and he came to Ironmere the way rogues always came, through the back routes, smelling of wind and somebody else's territory, carrying nothing but a pack and a story he wasn't going to tell you straight. He'd been registered as a traveling marked blood, a rare classification reserved for wolves who carried a secondary bloodline activation. The council granted them 3-day guest status and kept tabs on them in the commercial record, which meant he passed through my desk. He came to collect his transit papers personally. This was unusual. Most rogues sent an intermediary. He walked in, looked at me across the counter, and stopped moving entirely, the way a prey animal stops. You shouldn't be walking free, he said, not unkindly, almost like he was frightened on my behalf. Excuse me. Your seal, he said, quieter now, leaning forward like he didn't want the walls to hear. It's degrading. Anyone with secondary bloodline sensitivity can feel it. I could feel it from the settlement gate. Whatever's inside you, it's waking up. He looked at me like I was a bomb someone had left on a kitchen table. You need to leave this place before they decide to reseal you, because the second time they do it... He stopped. The second time? He shook his head and took his transit papers. Just leave, he said, before they make sure there isn't a third. He was gone before I could call after him, and for the first time since the night of the binding ceremony, I didn't feel nothing. I felt the thing inside me shift, like something very old had just heard its name spoken aloud for the first time in years. That night, I heard things. Not words, not voices, instincts. The way you know to pull your hand back before you fully process the heat. Impressions. Flashes. Elder Thane standing in a stone chamber with 2 other elders, and a feeling of urgency radiating from the image so strongly that I sat up in bed and knocked my lamp off the table. Alpha Scott's hands, specifically his hands, pressing flat against a stone surface, and the impression of something being held down, contained a map, a very specific point on a very specific map. The old mountain boundary, the section no one surveyed because everyone said the rock was unstable. I lay in the dark for a long time, telling myself these were just stress responses, anxiety, exhaustion. Then I thought about the rogue's face, the way he'd looked at me, not with contempt, the way the pack did, not with avoidance, the way the elders did, with recognition. He'd seen whatever I was, and he'd been afraid for me, not of me. That was the first time I let myself consider that the elders might not have been protecting the pack from me. They might have been protecting themselves. I found Elder Thane in the archive corridor, alone, carrying a stack of sealed documents I recognized as coming from the restricted bloodline registry, the ones I was specifically never permitted to access. I waited until he turned the corner into the narrow walkway between the stone pillars, the section with no alternate exits. Then I stepped in front of him. He dropped the documents, not because he was startled, because the temperature in the corridor dropped 6 degrees the moment I stepped into his path, and the nearest wall sconce flared bright enough to cast sharp-edged shadows. I didn't do either of those things intentionally, but I watched his face cycle through 3 distinct emotions in the space of 1 second: composure, calculation, and underneath both of them, the raw animal fear of a wolf who understood that the predator hierarchy had just silently rearranged itself. "I read your log," I said. He didn't deny it. He bent, gathered the papers with careful precision, and stood, looked at a point just past my shoulder. "You weren't supposed to see that." "No, I was supposed to keep filing maps and not asking questions." I kept my voice level. I was shaking inside, but whatever was waking up in me made the shaking feel far away, like turbulence in a plane you've already decided isn't going to crash. What is a seal? What did you seal? What am I? A long silence. Then Thane said very quietly, "You were never rejected. I know that now. Tell me what I was instead." He looked at his hands, then at the sconce, which was still burning twice as high as it should. "There are 3 things in this world," he said finally. "Wolves, humans, and what came before both." He met my eyes for the first time in 3 years. "Your bloodline doesn't come from the wolf lineage. It doesn't come from any registered pack or known hybrid branch. It runs parallel to all of it. Older than the first alpha bond, older than territory law, or rank structure, or anything the council governs." "What does that mean?" "It means the binding ceremony wasn't designed for what you carry. When you stepped into the circle, when whatever lives in you began to surface, the elders made a decision in under 60 seconds. He swallowed. They sealed it. Buried the bloodline activation under a containment mark, made it look like a failed bonding to everyone watching. Why? The pause before his answer was the most honest thing anyone in Ironmere had ever given me. Because what you are doesn't answer to pack law. It doesn't recognize alpha authority. It doesn't fit inside any structure we have. And something that powerful, that ungovernable. He stopped. We didn't know how to control it, so we buried it, and we've been making sure it stayed buried ever since. Later, much later, after all of this was over, someone would ask me what the awakening had felt like from the outside, and the answer they got, from a wolf who'd been standing 30 feet away when the seal broke, was this. The air got heavy, not like a storm, like something compressed, like the atmosphere was being rearranged, and then every wolf in the clearing, 23 alphas, 7 elders, the full council, dropped to one knee, not because they chose to, because their bodies made that decision without consulting them. He'd paused, and she wasn't even trying. But that was later. Right now, I was still standing in a cold corridor with a frightened elder, and a decision I hadn't made yet. The decision was coming, though. Whatever was in me had heard what Thane said, and it was done being patient. I walked back to my quarters through the quietest version of Ironmere I had ever moved through. Wolves stepping aside before they consciously realized they were doing it. Children falling silent mid-play as I passed. A group of pack warriors who had never once acknowledged me in 3 years, pressing against the wall of the training lane to give me room. They didn't understand why they were giving. Inside, I sat on the edge of my bed and thought about 17. The version of me who had stood in that chalk circle, terrified and hopeful, doing the math of belonging. If I bond, I become real. If I'm chosen, I have a place. If I'm wanted, then all the years of being treated like background noise will have been a prelude, not a verdict. And they had looked at that girl, frightened, eager, trying so desperately to fit, and they had chosen, without a second's hesitation, to bury her alive, not because she was dangerous to others, because she was dangerous to them, to their authority, their hierarchy, their carefully maintained system of control. The thing inside me had never been a threat. It had been a problem, and nobody in Ironmere dealt with problems by solving them. They dealt with them by making sure they stayed problems that nobody talked about. I made a decision, not a dramatic one, not the kind of decision that announces itself with fire and fury, a quiet one, the kind that settles into you like a key turning. I was going to stop cooperating. It started small. Time distortions, not long ones. A second here, 3 seconds there. Moments that seemed to repeat themselves like a record skipping, so brief I could convince myself I'd imagined them. Except other people started noticing. Marit, the baker's daughter, who had never once spoken to me in 3 years, stopped me in the market lane and said, "Did everything just stop for a second? Did you feel that?" I looked at her, said nothing. She backed away slowly. The pressure was harder to hide. It wasn't physical. No one was being shoved or crushed. But something in the atmosphere around me had thickened, and wolves felt it instinctively the way they feel a dominant alpha entering a room. Their bodies registered a hierarchy that their minds refused to acknowledge, and the dissonance was making everyone in Ironmere quietly, inexplicably anxious. The most alarming symptom wasn't the time glitches or the pressure. It was the submission. It happened for the first time with a patrol warrior I'd passed every day for 18 months, without acknowledgement. He rounded the corner at full stride, saw me, and before he took another step, his chin had dropped, and his shoulder line had lowered. The unconscious, physical vocabulary of deference to an alpha. He looked horrified the moment he realized what his body had done. And I felt, somewhere beneath the seal, something vast and calm and enormously old note what had just happened with something like satisfaction. Scott found me at the mountain boundary. I'd gone there because of the instinct flash I'd had, the specific point on the old survey map, the section everyone avoided. Standing at the rock face, I could feel something old and structural vibrating in the stone. Not warmth, resonance, like 2 tuning forks placed close together. He came alone. That was the first signal that this wasn't an official council action. Scott never came anywhere alone when it was official. The second signal was that he stopped 12 feet away from me and didn't advance. An alpha stopping at 12 feet. I let that sit between us. "You found the sealing stone," he said. "Is that what it is?" The ceremony wasn't just a mark. There's a physical anchor. The elders bound it here, in the rock. They thought the mountain's age would reinforce the containment. He looked at the stone. "It's not working anymore, is it?" Why are you here alone?" A long pause. Scott had the quality of a man who had thought about what to say in a situation for years and still hadn't found the right words. "The council wants to reinitiate containment, full reseal. They think if they do it formally, with the High Seer present, they can hold it another decade." "And you?" He looked at me then, actually looked at me, not through me, not past me, at me. And what I saw in his face wasn't what I'd spent 3 years assuming was there. No contempt, no calculation. Something much harder to be angry at. Guilt. "I knew," he said, "from before the ceremony. My father was the Alpha when they sealed the last one. Someone like you, 40 years ago. He told me what to watch for, what bloodline anomalies looked like when they surfaced. He told me what to do if one emerged on my territory." He stopped. "I watched you for 6 months before the ceremony. I knew what you were, and I let them do it." "Why?" The word came out quieter than I meant it to. "Because I was 28, and I had just become Alpha, and I was terrified." He said it plainly, not as an excuse, as a fact. Not of you, of what the council would do to my pack if I harbored something they couldn't govern. They've dissolved packs for less, removed alphas, restructured entire settlements. He exhaled slowly. "I told myself it was the right decision for Ironmere, and every year I watched you get smaller and quieter and more carefully invisible, and I understood it was the right decision for me, and I couldn't separate those two things into something I could live with." The seal in my chest registered his proximity differently than everyone else's. Not as submission. As recognition. The way two people from the same country recognize each other's accent in a foreign city. I pushed that information aside. "The council is preparing a reseal," I said. "Yes. When?" "The High Seer arrives at dawn." I turned back to the mountain. "Then we have tonight." They came for me before dawn. Not Scott. The council. Elders Thane, Morrow, and Asha in full ceremonial dress, with 6-pack enforcers, and the transit papers that meant they'd already arranged for me to be moved to the sealing chamber without alerting the general population. Clean. Efficient. The kind of operation that Ironmere had clearly done before. I was awake. I'd been awake all night. Not planning. I hadn't done much planning. Whatever was inside me had been surfacing steadily since the mountain boundary visit, and sleep had felt less like rest, and more like trying to hold still while something enormous unfurled its wings inside your chest. Elder Thane spoke with measured gentleness. "Emily, you've become aware of your situation. That's understandable. And we want to reassure you that what we're doing tonight is for the protection of everyone in this settlement, including you. The High Seer's containment work is precise. You won't feel the seal once it's placed." "I know," I said. He looked relieved. "I mean, I know that's what you believe," I clarified. "Walk me to the sealing chamber. I won't resist." I felt the thing inside me settle into something crystalline and quiet, like a held breath before a word, like the moment just before a seal breaks open. The sealing chamber was older than the record hall, older than most of the settlement, cut directly into the mountain foundation, lit by 4 permanent wall sconces that burned with preserved flame. The floor was inlaid with the same chalk and elder ash circle from the binding ceremony, but wider, reinforced, the kind of circle you build when you expect something to push back. The High Seer was already there. He was smaller than I'd remembered, shorter than Thane, which surprised me. But the moment he turned from the circle, I understood why no one questioned his authority. It wasn't his size or his age or the ceremonial marks on his forearms. It was his eyes. The eyes of someone who had spent decades in proximity to things that shouldn't exist and had made a professional practice of deciding what to do with them. He looked at me the way a surgeon looks at a complicated case. Clinical. Not unkind. Resolved. "You've been told what's happening tonight," he said. Statement, not question. "Yes." "Good. Resistance will make it harder. Compliance will make it brief." He gestured toward the circle. "Step in." 23 wolves had gathered at the chamber's perimeter. Alphas. Senior warriors. The council in full. This wasn't precautionary. This was a demonstration of force. They wanted whatever lived in me to see the numbers and understand the arithmetic. I stepped into the circle and felt the seal respond, not with resistance, with recognition. It had been waiting for this room. The High Seer began the chant. Old language, older than pack speech, the syllables that predated the first alpha bonding. The circle lit at the edges with pale silver light. The elders joined, voices low and synchronized. The enforcers pressed forward, closing the perimeter. I felt the new seal beginning to form. Pressure from the outside in, like hands pressing against a door. And from the inside, something that had been pressing outward for 21 years pressed back. Not violently, not explosively. It simply refused. The silver light in the circle fragmented, not extinguished. Fragmented, like light hitting a prism, splitting into colors that had no names in any language the elders knew. The chant faltered. The High Seer's voice cracked, not from fear, from the acoustics changing, the air pressure in the chamber shifting as though something was rearranging the space. The first alpha's knees hit the floor. He didn't look like he'd been struck. He looked like he'd been reminded of something he'd forgotten, a fundamental fact about the world, like gravity reasserting itself. The second followed. The third. Down the line, through the chamber, through the 23 wolves at the perimeter. Pack warriors, senior alphas, the most dominant men in Ironmere, dropping to one knee without a sound, without understanding why, their bodies resolving a hierarchy that had existed long before the first pack law was written. The seal split. I felt it go, not like a wound opening, like a lock turning from the right side for the first time. The space didn't shatter. The walls stayed whole. No one screamed. But for exactly 4 seconds, the air in the chamber held an impression of something so old and so vast that the word power felt embarrassingly small for it. And then the 4 seconds passed, and the chamber was quiet. The High Seer was still standing. He was the only one. He looked at me across the broken circle with the expression of a man reassessing everything he thought he understood about his life's work. "We couldn't have held it," he said finally, almost to himself. "Even if you'd cooperated, it was going to break regardless." He exhaled slowly. The question was always going to be what happened when it did. "And what's happening?" I asked. He looked at the 23 wolves still on their knees. "Honestly, I don't know. And in 40 years of working with bloodlines that shouldn't exist, I have never said that before." I walked out of the sealing chamber, through the corridor, into the pre-dawn dark of Ironmere. Behind me, I heard it start. Not screaming, not chaos. Something quieter, and in its own way worse. The sound of an authority structure trying to reorganize itself around a problem it had no language to describe. I stopped in the corridor doorway long enough to watch it happen. Elder Thane had moved to the broken circle's edge, hands pressed flat against nothing, speaking in a low, urgent voice, to no one who was listening. The alphas around him were still on their knees, not all of them willing to rise yet, some staring at their own hands as though they no longer trusted what those hands would do. The High Seer stood at the center of it, surrounded by 40 years of professional certainty, and for the first time in what I suspected was a very long career, he did not speak. He simply looked at the cracked elder ash lines on the chamber floor and understood, with the particular horror of the genuinely expert, that he had never understood any of this at all. I didn't go back. I didn't need to. The consequence was already in motion, not something I had to place, but something they had built into their own decision the moment they made it. 23 alphas on their knees, the full Elder Council assembled as witnesses to their own undoing. The High Seer, a man whose entire authority rested on the belief that he understood power and could contain it, standing alone in a broken circle with no ritual left to perform and no explanation that would hold. By morning, the entire settlement would know. That image, 23 alphas on their knees, the High Seer silent in a broken circle, the elders with no explanation left, did not stay in a room. It spread the way truth always spreads after it has been suppressed long enough, fast and without asking permission. 21 years of careful, unquestioned authority, built on the assumption that what lived in me could be managed, gone. Not because I had taken it, because they had staked everything on a lie. And tonight, the lie had simply stopped holding. That was their consequence. Public, permanent, built from nothing but their own choices. I kept walking. The sky was that particular shade of dark blue that precedes light without committing to it. Honest about what it is, not pretending to be more than the last breath before morning. Scott was at the settlement edge. He'd been standing there long enough that the dew had settled on his shoulders. He looked at me, the way you look at something when you've spent 20 minutes rehearsing what you're going to say, and then watched all the words become irrelevant. I stopped beside him. Neither of us said anything for a while. "Is it done?" he asked. "The seal is gone." "Are you—" "I'm fine," I considered. "I think I'm fine. I think I've been fine this entire time. That's what's strange. I've spent 3 years being careful and small and invisible, and I didn't feel different then. I don't feel dramatically different now. I'm just—" I searched for the right word. "Less edited." He was quiet for a moment. "What will you do?" Honest question. No calculation in it. He wasn't asking as an alpha managing a situation. He was asking as someone who had made a decision he couldn't unmake and was trying to understand its consequences. I thought about 21 years of edited existence, 3 years of deliberate invisibility, a chalk circle, and a whispered sentence, and a life organized around the space where something should have been, but wasn't. I thought about the rogue's face, that brief, frightened flash of recognition, and how it had felt, for the first time, to be seen accurately. I thought about the elder's careful logs, and Scott's deliberate blindness, and a High Seer who had just admitted, at the end of a 40-year career, that he'd been building cages for things he didn't understand. "I think," I said slowly, "that I'll figure out what I am before anyone else gets the chance to decide for me." He nodded. Not as an alpha, as someone who understood, finally, that the decision was not his to make. I looked at him for a moment longer than I needed to, long enough that it meant something. He had stood at the edge of this settlement and watched me become smaller for 3 years. He had known my name on the day of the ceremony and looked through me the morning after. I didn't hate him for it. I understood now exactly what he had been afraid of, and understanding it was not the same as forgiving it. Some doors, once they've been closed long enough, don't open again, even when the person on the other side is finally ready to reach for the handle. Take care of Ironmere, I said, not take care of yourself, not come find me when you're ready. Just that, the settlement, the thing he had chosen over me, offered back to him without ceremony. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. He'd had 21 years to say things, and now I was walking away, and the choice he'd made at 28 had just become permanent. The thing inside me, the thing that had no name in pack law or elder registry or high seer classification, settled back into its place in my chest, not dormant, not sealed, just present, patient the way only ancient things are patient, like something that is learned over a very long existence, that it does not need to rush. It had been waiting 21 years. It could wait a little longer, but this time it was waiting for me, not for them. The distinction mattered more than I had words for. I turned away from Ironmere. The sun was starting, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, the thing rising inside me felt less like something waking from a long sleep, and more like something that had been awake all along, watching, waiting, deciding whether this world was worth the trouble of belonging to it. They had spent 21 years afraid of what I might do if I was free. They had never thought to ask what I might choose instead. That was always their mistake. They were protecting the world from me, but what they were really protecting was themselves, from realizing I never needed their world to begin with. Emily's story isn't about rage or revenge or the moment the power breaks free. It's about what happens after the seal breaks, after the elders lose their grip, after the alpha who looked through you finally has to look at you and realizes too late that the window closed while he was deciding. Emily didn't destroy anything. She didn't need to. She walked out of a chamber full of people who had spent 21 years making themselves the center of her story, and she left them in it, alone, accountable, with no seal left to hide behind, and no subject left to contain. That's not a small thing. That is everything. If Emily's journey reached something in you, hit subscribe to Adeline's Story Vault. New stories drop every week, and every one of them is written for people who know what it feels like to be underestimated. Like this video, leave a comment telling me, what would you do the moment the seal breaks? I'll see you in the next story.